Welcome back, everyone. We just finished talking about some non-Mendelian traits in genetics. So there's not definitely a one recessive and one dominant allele for that trait, but it could be traits that have incomplete dominance or codominance, but also traits that are polygenic. So there's multiple genes that are controlling that one trait, or kind of the opposite of that, pleiotropic, where there's one gene that's controlling multiple and has cascading effects on multiple traits. So we're just going to continue talking a little bit about some of these rule breakers and some other non-Mendelian traits in genetics. So let's get back to those files. Okay, so we left off talking about pleiotropy, and the classic example there is sickle cell anemia. So the next thing we're going to talk about are sex-linked traits. And as we discussed earlier in chapter 6 and 7, when we were talking about mitosis and meiosis, right, we've talked about how humans have 23 sets of chromosomes. So you have two chromosome ones, one from your mom, one from your dad. And you have two chromosome twos, right? One from your mom, one from your dad. But the sex chromosomes are different, right? So if you're a female, you could have two X's, but males have an X and if it's on a non-sex chromosome, it's called an autosome, okay? And then the sex chromosomes are X and Y. Because males inherit only one X chromosome, right? So they have one X and they have one Y. If there's a mutation on that X chromosome, a recessive trait, it's going to show up in that man, even though he only has one copy of the recessive. So let's say we're talking about something where the recessive trait, you have a big R is dominant and a little r is the recessive trait. If a female gets one copy of that recessive trait, she gets one copy of the dominant and she's not going to show that trait. But if the male gets one copy of that recessive trait, that's the only copy he has. The Y chromosome's not carrying the same genes. So a man has a greater chance of displaying that trait. So these are called sex-linked traits, and they tend to be more commonly show up in men. So some examples of sex-linked traits in humans are, these are not related to sex though. Remember that X chromosome has a lot of genes on it and they don't have to do with sex. So red-green color blindness is one. And another sex-linked trait is hemophilia, which is a blood clotting disorder where your blood doesn't clot properly. These are much more likely to be in men than in women. So here's just a picture of how these could work. Here on the left, we have a father. If they have blue, it means that they're showing the trait, they're affected. If they're brown, they're unaffected. And for females, because they carry two copies of each gene, right? On the X chromosome, she could have both blue and brown, showing that she's carrying it. She's a heterozygote, right? So she has one dominant copy and one recessive. So she's carrying the recessive, but you don't see it. So here we have a father who's showing the trait. Let's say this is hemophilia, and the mother's unaffected. So to his daughters, right, it's on his X chromosome. That is the only X that he can give, is an X that has this trait. So to his daughters, he's giving this hemophilia gene. The mom, however, is unaffected, so she's giving everybody a normal X, which means her sons are unaffected. They got a Y from their dad, they got a normal X from their mom. This son over here on the right got a normal X from his mom. The girls both got normal X's from their mom, but they also got that carrier, that mutated X from their dad. When these girls go on to have children, which is what we're seeing over here, right? This girl is now having children. Even if she has children with a man who's unaffected by the trait, she's passing on this trait, right? So she has two X's. Half of her X's don't have carry that mutation. So she can have unaffected sons and an unaffected daughter. She also passes it on to her daughter who could carry it, and then half of her sons may have that trait. Okay, because the sons are not getting a normal X from their dad. From their dad, they're only getting Ys. So this son here is going to show this trait just like this is his grandpa over here that I'm circling here, like just like his grandfather had it. This is, I've never actually seen the show The Crown. I don't know if anybody's watched that, but I've had friends like ask me questions about it and like, how does this work? So this is how hemophilia actually spread through a lot of the royal families in Europe, is that one of the English queens was a carrier, passed it on to her daughters, and then they went off to marry various kings of Europe, and their sons ended up having hemophilia. And this is how in Russia, one of the Romanovs had hemophilia, and that's how Putin got his power by saying he could help the son. So if you're at all a historian of European history, which I am not, this relates to all of that. Okay, so these are sex-linked traits, and we're going to talk more about these in lab as well. And then, of course, there are traits that are genetically controlled, but they get turned on and off by the environment because all of your genes are not being expressed at all times. And you know this just because your body's not always making adrenaline. You don't always have that adrenaline rush, right? There's sometimes that gene gets turned on and you start making adrenaline, right? When something is scary or exciting, right? You get that rush. This happens with a lot of genes. Babies are born with their entire genome, but the genes for puberty get turned on, right, as they age. Those genes are not turned on all of the time or for the first, like 12 or 13 years of their life. So different genes get turned on at different times. Sometimes this is an age-related thing, but sometimes it's environmental, right? Did something just happen outside to scare me? That's going to get my adrenaline pumping, right? And so there are some things that may get turned on by other environmental cues like temperature. So this is a classic example in some animals where their extremes, like their ears and nose and toes, can turn a dark color if they are exposed to cold at a certain point in their development, but not if they never experience cold. So this has to be at a certain developmental stage after they're born. So if you took a rabbit that had always been hot for the first year of its life and then, exposed it to cold, it's not going to magically turn black, have black nose overnight, right? But this melanin gene gets turned on at different temperatures. So we can get a lot of information through studies with identical twins, right? And obviously it's hard to study humans and do experiments on them. That's not ethical. But you can just see that if any of you have friends that are identical twins, or if anybody is an identical twin, they can have different diseases. So they may both have the gene for that disease, or they may be more likely to get that disease, but that same gene doesn't always get turned on. They can get different injuries. They can have different opinions. Many behaviors are genetically based, but whether those get turned on or off depends on the environment, because our genes are interacting with the environment. So diet, exercise, chemicals, all of those affect your genes. And anybody who kind of followed the Kelly twins, there's Mark Kelly and I never remember his other name. They are both astronauts. Mark Kelly is now a senator in Arizona. I think it's Mark that's a senator, but they're both astronauts. One of them went up into space for a long period on the International Space Station. I think he was up for 6 or 9 months while the other was on the ground. And when he landed, when the space brother landed, they did a lot of genetics tests on them. And the news stories at the time were that his genes had changed, right? His DNA changed. And that's not true. His genome didn't change. You're born with your genes and your genes stay the same, but different genes get turned on and off. That's what changed. So bone density changes. Perhaps the gene for like continually creating bone density, that changes in space. And you've probably heard that like weight bearing exercises increase bone density. Well, if you don't bear any weight for 6 months, it's going to decrease, right? So different things like that, blood pressure genes, all of those change during an exposure to space. So they could look at these identical twins and see what was different. there's a really cool article, and I will I've put the link down here, called The Mixed Up Brothers of Bogota, and it's about these two sets of twins. You can see these two are identical, and these two are identical, but they were switched at birth. They both went home as fraternal twins, and they did not know that they had identical brothers until they were in their 20s. And a mutual friend of one of them saw the other, and kind of figured out that they didn't know what she was talking about. They didn't know her. Why is she talking? Why is she acting like she does know them? And they were able to piece together that they actually were identical twins. And it's a kind of a tragic story about the way they were raised, and they didn't know their parents, and some of the parents had died at that point. But also the things that were similar between the identical twins who had never met one another until their 20s, and the things that were different due to their environment. So one set of twins had, when they were young, both had a speech impediment. So I don't know if it was these two guys on the left or the two on the right, but they're identical twins. They both had a speech impediment, but one of them was raised in the city where there were, the public schools had speech therapists, and he had, gotten through and worked through with speech therapy his speech impediment. His identical brother had lived in a very rural area and had had none of those services growing up, and even in his 20s he then still had the speech impediment. So you can work, your genes don't determine everything about you, because there are obviously external things that you can change. So this was a very interesting study into that. And then finally, we have discussed all of this time about how genes are independent of one another, right? And they have this independent assortment during meiosis, right? So if we're looking here at pea color and pea wrinkliness, they're separate traits, right? So you can have a wrinkly yellow pea, or you could have a smooth yellow pea, is what we see down here, right? Or you could have a wrinkly green pea, or you could have a smooth green pea, right? Wrinkliness and color are separate things. But every law, so that's Mendel's law of independent assortment, right? These genes are independent of one another. One is wrinkliness, one is color. They're not the same thing. But if we think about what is a gene and where does it exist, right? They're on these chromosomes. And we have, for humans, we have 23 sets of chromosomes, but we have thousands and thousands and thousands of genes. So they have to be all packed in next to each other, right? So if this red line is a chromosome, all these little blue lines are the genes, right? And if you recall, during meiosis 1, there is crossing over, right? So these two can switch with each other, and they could swap this little bit with this little bit, right? Or they could swap this little bit here with this little bit. But as they're doing that, and I'll do another, let's say, little orange swap here. Let's say this is gene number 2 and gene number 3. They're next to each other on here. So when things cross over, they're probably going to go together, right? If one gene ends up moving over onto the other chromosome, the other one's probably going to too, because they're right next to each other. So genes that are right next to each other and tend to go together, and these things are called linked genes. So examples in humans will be a redhead. Red hair tends to go with pale skin and freckles. Of course, there are redheads that don't have pale skin and freckles, but most do. And it doesn't mean that it's one gene controlling all of those things. It's that those genes are right next to each other. So they tend to go together. So those are linked genes. And that is the end of chapter 8 for us. So finish taking your notes, and I will see you in the next one.